Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a late night Wandering Scribe audiobook episode here on the channel. I know it's been a few days since I last did the last major one, but I'm almost done reading The Gathering. And once The Gathering is finished, I will then turn my attention to Michael, Last Angel of Earth. So, where we last left off, the heroes finally converged at the Blood Sand Arena. And now they're on the run. Dragons from the unknown have entered the war. And two of our heroes have been separated from their party. So without further ado, let's dive in. Chapter 31. The burning sandstorm proved to be a deadly force of nature, yet the heroes barely managed to escape the firestorm. Decimus turned around to take a head count as they neared the edge of the forest. "Is everyone all here?" said the Roman. "I think so," replied Teoda. However, Symbol disagreed. "We lost Richard and Amines." "They did not leave the storm," said the Celt. "Sure enough, she was right. They were missing a basilisk." Decimus turned his horse around. "We have to go back," he said to them. Everyone agreed. However, there was still one issue. The storm was still raging, and the possibility of getting lost was high. They would be of no use to them if they got lost themselves. Symbol was becoming restless. "We can't just leave them out there. We have to save them." "I understand your concern. We all do, but we barely got out of that hellstorm ourselves. A plan is needed if we're going back in," said Decimus. As the heroes dismounted, they all huddled and quickly bounced off ideas of how to save their friends. And during their discussion, Avalon's ears picked up a faint sound rising over the storm. He turned his head over his shoulders and saw a faint image approaching them. He couldn't make it out at first, but the image was becoming more and more apparent as he walked into the storm's direction. His eyes widened with shock. "We got company!" he shouted. The rest of the humans saw the giant image rapidly approaching them. They soon scrambled to grab their gear, but to their surprise, the massive object nearing them fell a few yards short. It landed on the sand with a heavy thud, dust flying elsewhere and everywhere. The noise spooked the basilisk and Decimus' horse. Cautiously, the heroes approached the crater with their weapons at the ready. As they neared the massive hole, they found a badly burned wyvern, a young one. The creature was smaller than the elder, but still very dangerous to a human. Once well armored, its soft underbelly was raw due to the burning sands. It reared its reptilian head, and, while it was still weak, let out a warning hiss. Symbol pulled out her knife and was about to kill the beast when Avalon stopped her. "Wait. Maybe we don't need to kill it," said Avalon. Symbol was puzzled by this. "In case you forgot, these things tried to kill us," protested Symbol. The Wendigo explained that this creature could help them find their friends. He removed his weapons and placed them outside the crater, and slowly approached the wounded animal. Putting his hand outward, he hoped to get close to the beast. The young wyvern tried to lunge at him, but, again, it was too weak from the storm. When Avalon approached the beast, he saw its underbelly and knew what it needed. Reaching into his leather pouch, he pulled out a little jar. He twisted the top off and, using two of his fingers, scooped out some cream. He gently applied it to the wyvern. While he did this, he began talking to the beast. "What is your name?" asked Avalon. The creature said nothing. He merely snarled at him as he applied the ointment, and after a while, the creature spoke. "Garston," it said. Everyone, except for Vortigern, was surprised that he could speak. After Avalon finished putting on the cream, he covered the area with a cloth bandage made of nyronium. With the bandage covering the wound, he backed away from Garston. A minute passed, and Garston gradually began to stand up on his own. He unfolded his broad wings and flapped them slowly. Shaking off the sand, the young wyvern looked at the people around him. He then turned his gaze back to Avalon. "What brings your kind back to this world?" asked the hunter. "You should know that by now, Nyronian." "We promised we would return," replied Garston. Why was your sister trying to kill us?" "Simple. A prophecy warned by the Draconian priests that the first king of Nyron would come from a land across the stars and unite the clans. I believe that your friend Amines is that king. Of course, my father cannot let that happen, thus he desires to reclaim what was once his, and spell the prophecy." The moonstones, said Tira. Garcia nodded his head. The guardian never mentioned such a prophecy to me, Avalon thought to himself. That is because your guardian likes to be selective with their information. I guess she made you promise not to tell your new friends the whole truth about the stone. Avalon quickly turned his head to the wyvern. How the hell could he read his thoughts? Garcia turned his attention to the other humans. There is more going on here than you realize. I hope you succeed in your task of killing Kairos. That pretender has been a thorn in our sides for eons. Garcia lifted his wings up in the air and got himself airborne. He was about to leave when Avalon stepped in one last time. Wait, he said. I saved your life, and now you owe me a debt. Garcia grumbled. Of course. I'll look for your friends and return them if they are still alive. Until then, take care. Garcia flapped his broad wings in one motion in an impressive display of strength, and soared back into the sky, disappearing into the storm. Once he was gone, all eyes were on Avalon. Avalon? What the hell is going on? And the truth this time, said Decimus. Avalon clutched the medallion around his neck. Those are wyverns, said Mori. You know of them? Asked Tioda. Yes, we encountered a few of them on occasion. But that was a long time ago, replied Sparrow. Avalon could hear the Guardian's voice in his head. They are not ready, said the Guardian. It's no longer your decision to make, he said softly. He then turned his attention back to his friends and relayed them the story he told them before, but this time telling them the entire truth. That story I told you about the 3 clans and the Great Serpent, I only told you half of it. Centuries before us, a conqueror from the stars had goals of obtaining a rare mineral called Welun Ternesus, or moonstones. The conqueror was named Jafar, the son of Jozar Rastaban. Jozar is the father of all dragons. He is large enough to engulf a moon, and a moon fuels his powers, leading to his obsession for these stones. These stones can not only access time, but manipulate it as well. He uses their power to slow his aging and continue his conquest for plunder. Many eons ago he sent his eldest son, Jafar, to acquire and return the stones to Thuban, the homeworld. Out of all his children, Jafar was the worst. Cruel, wicked, and ruthless like his father. He had armies of machines, dragons, and mercenaries at his disposal. They journeyed with him to this land, but back then there were only 3 tribes, all fighting for control. The one she spoke of before, said Zimble. Avalon nodded. Indeed. In the past, as I mentioned previously, they all fought each other, suffering heavy casualties. They built the arena in the desert and trained champions to fight for their people, with the victor earning the right to rule, to prevent their people's extinction. That arena that we were just at was the same arena. New champions were trained and brought to that arena every year, but neither side won. That all changed when the invaders came. That year, 3 champions emerged: Jagan, Calvin, and Jean. They wanted to fight for the glory of the arena, but Jafar and his armies invaded during the fights. Their people tried to fight back, but their armies were far too advanced for them, and the tribes were quickly subdued. They were enslaved and forced to find the stones throughout the lands, except for the 3. They managed to escape and traveled far and wide, leading them to this valley. Neither one wanted to be with the other, but they knew that their best chance for survival was to stick as one. And during that time, Jean, Calvin, and Jagan got to know each other and realized they weren't so different after all. Then one night, as the stories go, they were greeted by 4 travelers, or rather strangers from the valley. Their names were Obsidian, Granite, Marie, and Steel, the Tainted. They belonged to an underground group of people who had escaped Jazar's wars in the skies many eons ago. In the story, they are taken back to their colony underneath the mountains and show them the stones. There they explain the power they hold and what will happen if the Father of Dragons acquires them. What happened next? They all ask. Avalon took a deep breath before continuing. On that night, they vowed to fight together as one and led an attack on Javar's forces days later. The clans, amazed by what they had seen, united for the first time in history and defeated the Dragon Prince. With the prince dead, his forces were driven back into the stars whence they came. The three became four, and, with their enemies gone, they made a pact to protect the stones if the father ever returned for revenge. For 4 eons there was peace. Though times changed and alliances ended, the legacy of the Seven lived on and inspired future generations to help each other in times of crisis. That is why we must win this. Not simply to expel Kairos and free this land, but to prepare it before a great evil comes. Possibly even greater. With the story finished, the heroes could not believe what they had heard. They were lost for words. Nothing could imagine that their summoning was something much greater, part of a bigger plan. After a while, Desmond spoke up. Damn, this is a lot to take in. I know we made a plan to save our friends, but we cannot forget that we have someone else to save first. They knew what he was referring to. The mage was still locked up in Castle Olympus and time was running out. He needed to be saved at all costs. Many did not like the idea of leaving their friends. What is the guarantee that Garson will keep his word? Asked Simple. Garson's a wyvern, and though young, they're bound by debts of saving, which means he has to bring our friends back. No Draconic can break a life debt until it has been completed, said Avalon. Grabbing their things, the heroes turned away from the desert and towards the forest. Simple gave one last look before joining the others. Please make it safe. Please make it out of there safely. Ominous. Chapter 32. Despite being in the shade, the heat from the storm could still be felt. Its burning sensation was still present. As the winds howled outside, Ominous managed to stop the bleeding. With his wounds manageable, he noticed Richard was starting to wake up. His face was still badly hurt, and one of his eyes was still swollen shut. However, his body received the worst of the burns. Every movement he made sent a shockwave of pain throughout his body. Ultimately, he lay where he was to keep whatever strength he had left. How long was I out? He asked softly. Not long, replied Ominous. Richard then noticed that, aside from his face, his body was covered in bandages. Did you do this? He asked. Ominous said nothing. You could have killed me and be done with it. Why? Curiosity, said the Spartan. Seeing as how we're stuck here, and you're in no condition to leave, neither can I figured you could ask, or rather answer, a few questions of mine. Richard let out a sigh and allowed the Spartan to ask. Tell me who you were before all of this. Richard straightened up as best he could. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice hoarse. Richard Hawke is. It's not my real name. My real name is Albert Le Maçon. I was born the son of an English lord with Norman and Templar roots. My childhood was, well, as expected. I was groomed to be my father's successor. I learned the ways of the sword, riding on horseback, reading and writing Latin, and understood the politics of my time. But I had no interest in being a lord or serving the king. I was young, headstrong, with a thirst for adventure and glory. I often got into a lot of trouble with the law at the time, and one day I got into a fight with another lord's son and killed him. I was brought to court and was expecting to be put to death. However, my life was spared at a cost. I was banished from my home and told never to return. Thus, I went on a ship bound for France and never looked back. On that day, I lost everything. All I had with me were a few coins and my sword. Then how did you get the name Richard Hawke? Asked Amanus. When I arrived in France, I experienced dark times. The two kingdoms were bitter about the French throne succession. I wandered from town to town, begging for scraps. One day I entered a tavern and ran into several drunken soldiers. One spilled their drink, thus they asked that I pay them back. I had no money, so I refused. The next thing I know, my head is slammed on a wooden table. One of the men went for my sword. I couldn't let them have it. Thus, naturally, I fought back. In the process, I suffered a broken skull, cracked ribs, and wound out flat on my back. I thought I was die there. But it seemed Lady Luck had other plans, and I was saved by a soldier of fortune, a mercenary, you could say. He was a few seasons older than me. Richard paused for a moment. He was a Genoese man named Valtena Mascaro. I remember he had thick curly black hair with an equally thick beard. He wore heavy leather and chain armor and spoke with a heavy accent. Valtena was a leader of a company of Genoese mercenaries called the Falchi, or the Hawks. I cannot remember what he said to me, but all I remember was being hoisted up and dragged back to their camp. Several weeks go by, and I ended up joining them. At first I loved being a Falchi. I was able to travel, experience adventures, and my skills were sort of improved, fighting numerous battles for France and my native England. Soon I became second under Valtena, and was seen as a son to him. He was the one who gave me the name Richard, in honor of the warrior king, Richard the Lionheart. For the first time, I thought I had it all. Then what changed? Asked Amanus. Richard paused for a moment before finishing his story. After the siege of Orleans in 1429, we were hired to hunt down a woman for the Burgundian League. Valtena gave me the responsibility of seeing this through. When I accepted the job, many in the company knew who we were going after. The Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc. For almost a year we hunted her, hoping to find her. At first, I thought it was a simple job. We helped the English and the Burgundians capture her in May of that year after the siege of Champagne, and I began to realize that this was no ordinary job. She was then taken to trial and sentenced to death by the courts. What happened next? Richard stopped himself. Amanus could see a tear forming in his eye. Spartan was curious of what was troubling him. Please continue. What happened at the trial? Richard took another deep breath in, and then exhaled. After we delivered her, the Burgundians asked that we stay and watch the trial. We all agree, though I wish that we didn't. When we captured her, she was wearing her beautiful armor, with a sword around her waist. Yet, as she was brought in, she was reduced to nothing more than a 19-year-old commoner. She wore a messy blue dress, and her once beautiful face was covered in cuts and dust. As she was brought forth, I knew this was wrong in my heart, but I couldn't say the words to change their minds. The courts deemed that she was a heretic and conspired with the devil. Many in the crowds wanted her to confess and spare her life, but she stayed true to her convictions. The court then sentenced her to death by fire. Soon everyone was moved outside the court and into the town's courtyard. There Joan was tied to a stake atop a pile of wood. Our clients then gave me the splendor of tying the last knot around her. As I approached, I couldn't look at her directly in her eyes. Before I went away, she spoke to me. Her last conversation with this world. What did she say? Asked Amanus. She told me that she forgave me. I got down as fast as I could before the executioner set the fire. At this moment, the court officials thought Joan would plead for her life. But she did the opposite. She just looked up into the sky and accepted her fate. Afterward, the Fauci were paid, and I was given her sword as my payment. I felt sick to my stomach. 3 days after her execution, I left the Fauci and became a lone wolf. I still worked as a mercenary, but my services would only be for the civilians, not the monarchy. Then I got word that the French kingdom was hunting down all Hawk members who assisted in Joan's death. I was a wanted man, and mercenaries were now hunting me. The last thing I remember was running in a forest with French soldiers behind me, looking into the cloudy sky and seeing a bright light cast over me. I thought it was the Lord punishing me for my wicked sins. And, well, the rest is history, finished Richard. Amanus said nothing after Richard's tale. He sat there in silence and reflected on what he had heard. He took a deep breath and thanked Richard for sharing. I was merely answering your question, replied Richard. Then you won't mind answering another. What happened to your friends, the ones immortalizing the glass blockers back at the village? You know the truth, said Richard. Not good enough. I want to hear it from you. What really happened? Richard explained that when he was summoned, the world was much different. The Cronai still feared Kairos, but they were not the only clans. Clan Darius gave the Cronai support in dealing with the ruler. The Desmodus, Saurian, and Aedo clans were still alive and openly rebelled against the ruler. For Richard and his company, they planned to steal the scepter and destroy it, hoping to eliminate Kairos' power and weaken him. At first they succeed in taking the scepter. They knew sooner or later Kairos would fight to reclaim it. As such, Richard and his friends gathered allies. They assembled a small army and made the ancient Saurian kingdom their stronghold. In their forts they held out for almost a year, and at first they thought Kairos would yield as his powers were depleting rapidly. But magic was not solely his one source of strength. He and his friends had vastly underestimated his intelligence. It turned out Kairos had sent one of his warlords to cause chaos amongst Clan Darius. He allied with a young usurper, Ursa, and the warlord soon clouded the young Wendigo's mind and openly challenged Avalon's father. As a result, Ursa killed Avalon's father and ordered the Wendigos to abandon the fort. Even without their aid, morale was still high until Kairos unleashed the second part of his plan. He called for his allies from the stars, and soon dragons, with Kairos' forces, converged on their fortification. They tried to hold out, but it was futile. Richard, Maury, and Sparrow wanted to stay and fight, but their friends, no. Brothers in arms told them that if they stayed, all was lost. Richard told Amanus that not a day went by that he regretted leaving his friends behind. After that, he and the others managed to get captured. Richard ended his conversation by saying that Kairos did some persuading when he and the others were locked up. You never had a chance, did you? Said Amanus. Richard then laid back down on the sand. No, we didn't. Now you know, he said. Amanus finally knew the truth. And after listening to Richard's story, his partner began to see the veteran differently. While he was still heated about the betrayal, he understood that given the circumstances, Richard did not have any options. Or rather, did not have the best options. As Amanus rested his head, he noticed the storm had died down. Helping his friend up, Amanus gathered their gear and went outside. As they left the comfort of their shelter, they saw a large shadow hover over them. Just then, a wyvern landed in front of them. It was Garston. The young serpent looked at the two before speaking. Richard, Amanus, come with me. Your friends need you. I'll explain everything along the way. The humans were hesitant. Do not worry. I'm under a life debt and must see it fulfilled. Please, there's not much time left. Looking back at each other, they reluctantly got on the serpent's back and held onto as the young dragon lifted itself off the ground. Once they got into the air, Garson flew back to the village. With enough luck, they might still be able to save this world. Chapter 33. Back in the village, everyone was still reeling from what had happened. Margaret and the elders were removing the dead bodies and placing them outside. In the main hall, the rest of the heroes were stuck formulating how to save the mage. Needless to say, patience were wearing thin. "Damn it all," shouted Avalon. "It's no use. We cannot have a direct assault on the castle without jeopardizing the mage's life. We're running out of options here, Avalon. We need to decide now," said Desmond. Sybil heard a commotion outside the great hall as everyone deliberated and argued. "Guys, quiet. I hear something." The noise grew louder, almost the sound of cheering. Just then the doors opened, and Amines and Richard emerged, arm in arm. Everyone was shocked and surprised. The two humans walked over. The Spartan handed Richard over to Morty and Sparrow. Sybil wrapped her arms around the Spartan suddenly and hugged him tightly. "Thought you were dead," she said. Amines could hear the sorrow in her voice. "Spartans don't die. We just go missing," joked Amines. She pitifully punched him in the arm. After that, everyone turned their attention to Richard. Decimus reached for his weapon, but Amines told him to let bygones be bygones. "He betrayed us," said Decimus. "I know," replied Amines. "Then why do you spare him?" Spartan answered that question. "Why did you guys spare Maury and Sparrow?" Decimus bit his tongue. Tira spoke up for him. "We gave him another chance," she said. Amines nodded his head in agreement. "Trust me, I understand what we're all feeling, but right now it's time to put past feelings aside and focus on the present. Right now, we need to work together." Spartan's blunt but truthful words moved everybody. With the seven together and reforged, they discussed their next plan. Avalon told Amines they could try to assault the castle, but they needed to have the element of surprise and deception on their side. An idea involving Richard popped into the Spartan's head. "Richard, is it safe to say that Cairo still believes you and the others still work for him?" "Yeah, I think so. Why?" "I think I might have a way for us to get inside the castle." "How?" asked Morty. "The way I see it, we're the only ones who know Ares is dead. I doubt Kairos has discovered this. Here's my plan. You and your friends will ride to the castle and present Kairos with the stone. If he asks why they wait, explain what happened in the arena, and tell them about the dragons. Sure, he'll buy that. What if he asks for proof?" Spartan drew off a curved claw and handed it to Richard. "He gave... It's a gift from our Savior. Anyhow, once you meet him, he'll ask for the stone. You cannot give it to him until you get the mage. Give your reasons, lie, whatever you have to do, but do nothing until you get the mage." "Where will you be?" asked Maury. "With you guys. We'll wear soldier armor and act as guards accompanying you. After Avalon on board here, they'll be waiting with the rest of the army for our signal." "And what is this signal?" inquired Avalon. "You'll know when you see it." "Any questions?" "How will we bait him?" Amines explained that they would merge Avalon's gemstones into a fake moonstone. "One other thing, are we taking Margaret with us?" Amines nodded his head. In such a position, it was dangerous for her to tag along. However, there was no other choice. After much deliberation, they agreed to Amines' plan. Richard then spoke up. "So, let's make sure I understand this correctly. Your plan hinges on the belief that Kairos, firstly, welcomes me with open arms, and believes any word I tell him, and somehow that gets us the mage out and alive, giving us the opportunity to kill the tyrant." "Yes," replied the Spartan. "Okay, no pressure then." Just then the villagers entered the great hall. Margaret, the elders, hell, everyone heard Amines' plan. The young Spartan looked around. All the attention was now on him. He saw the look in everyone's faces, a sense of loss and despair. He knew this feeling. The people of Sparta felt the exact same way when they lost their king. Breathing heavily, Amines decided it was time to rally their spirits. "I understand you're scared. You've been at the heel of a ruthless man for many years and have seen champions fall beneath him. He believes he can do as he wishes and suffer no consequences. Well, I think it's time we sent him a message of our own. Ammonus paused for a moment. At dawn, we ride out to face this enemy once and for all. He noticed the expressions on the people were beginning to change. The young Spartan continued talking. Tonight, we free this land from oppression and false idolatry, and bring about an era unlike any have ever seen. His voice grew louder with every sentence he spoke, each word filled with a passion and a courage, giving people enough strength to face such an enemy. One way or another, even if we die, tyranny dies along with us. The villagers let out a roaring cry of courage into the night. Their spirits have been lifted. Finally and truly, their champions have come home. After the speech, Ammonus and the others went to get their gear. The older soldier patted the young Spartan on the back and congratulated him on his speech. Simo poked fun at him and said he would be a great politician. Spartan laughed and went to grab his gear, only to realize it was gone. He searched all around but couldn't find his armor or sword, not even his helmet, or even most importantly, his shield. Is anyone else missing supplies? Said the Spartan. Everyone else began checking their supplies as well. Sure enough, theirs were gone as well. Where are they? Inquired Simple. Just then they heard footsteps coming from behind. It was the elders, holding large bundles. The Spartan approached them. What happened to our gear? Asked Ammonus. We destroyed them, one of the elders replied casually. Ammonus and the others were shocked by this. How the hell were they going to fire any weapons? But before they could say anything else, the elders placed the blanket on the ground and revealed a new weapon and armor, forged by the village blacksmiths. When you and your friends arrived a few days ago, our blacksmiths began working tirelessly. For many hours, they crafted new armor and weapons with nylon, and made upgraded versions of your armor from home. We kept them hidden until now. These will allow you to face Kairos and his pantheon without fear on an equal footing. No one could believe what they were seeing. In front of them were items that would not be invented for several years or even centuries back home. As they took their respective belongings, the elders wished for them to put them on, so that they could see. These looked at each other and went to different stables to change. After a few minutes, all the heroes wore their new gear and brandished their new weapons. Well, how does everyone feel? Asked one of the elders. Ammonus was the first to step out of the stables. He looked not that different from what he had worn previously. He still wore his helmet, which was based on the Corinthian design. As for the rest of him, he looked like the Colossus of Rhodes. His body was encased in bronze called a cuirass musculata. It was a single sheet of bronze hammered and tempered to form the developed bodies of Spartan soldiers. Bracers and leg protectors protected his body. Although he missed the battle damage, his family shield was returned to its full glory. Looking around his waist, he saw a sword was attached. But unlike his Xiphos sword, this sword was a kopis, a one-handed, single-edged curved forward blade that would be made famous by the future ruler of Greece, Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Now he resembled a figure from the Odyssey. He had never received such a gift like this before. Just as he finished admiring himself, Decimus then appeared. You look like a proper soldier now, said the old Roman. Ammonus turned, and Decimus was different as well. The older Roman's outdated chainmail armor was upgraded to a new armor that would dominate the late Republic and throughout the Roman Empire, the Lorica Segmentada. Unlike chainmail, the steel armor protected the shoulder and torsos. The chest was made of iron strips and held together straps inside. Like Ammonus, he also had metal bracers covering his forearms and greaves for his legs. In addition, his helmet was now the Imperial Gallic helmet, a design that would not have been invented for several hundred years. This design had a deep neck guard, brow guard, and cheek pieces to protect the wearer's face. His sword and dagger were sharpened to perfection. Even the handles were made of bone instead of wood. The one add-on he had not expected was a shield. Back home in his youth, he trained with a shield, but no longer needed it when he joined the cavalry. Yet unlike the shields back home, this was a rectangular semicircle shield that paired with others to form an impenetrable steel barrier. Decimus felt like a young man. Soon the others started to emerge. While some were vastly different, some remained the same. Samuel and Tira almost mirrored one another. Both wore a leather tunic and pants with a sash wrapped around their waist. Various animal bones decorated their clothes. The differences were their weapons and headgear. For Sybil, she carried a dagger sheathed behind her back, along with a pouch and her second weapon, a securus, or Roman axe. On her head, she wore a metal headband. In addition to leather, Tara also wore animal pelts and chainmail. The chainmail wrapped around her arms, chest, and hips. A horn hung off the backside of her waist. Her helmet had a whole faceplate. Regarding weapons, Tara abandoned her clubs for new weapons, and ate to get her a polearm and shield. As for Richard, the English knight turned mercenary, his armor reflected his ambiguous career. It was a set of interwoven metal plates over chain mail, topped by a visor barbuta helmet. Its sole design was to protect against any stray arrow or blade strike. The partial plate of the armor was segmented along the torso, arms, and leg joints, providing the Englishman great dexterity while granting plenty of protection. In a cruel twist, his new sword mirrored the famous sword once carried by Joan of Arc. He also gained 2 new crossbows, each with armor-piercing tips and iron bolt heads. And much like Tira and Sybil, Mori and Sparrow were the same. Mori resembled a samurai. His armor combined lacquered wood and metal, covering most of the body with worn leather, chainmail, and cloth underneath. He wore a traditional kabuto helmet, and his mouth and nose were covered by a mempo, oni mask. Instead of one sword, he carried 2. As their heads encountered going on as flint weapons, they were upgrading to a new type of rifle, one that would outlive them and their friends: bolt-action rifles. These futuristic weapons allowed them to fire more rounds accurately with devastating precision. Speaking of the Mohawk, Kanatagonha carried a war lance with his tomahawk and knife slung around his waist. His quiver carried a variety of new arrows, and while he dressed in no armor, the blacksmith provided him with war paint synonymous with his heritage and the culture of the Mohawk people. Together, the 7 heroes were transformed into warriors of legend, each feeling a sense of pride. Now they had a chance to fight Kairos. And before riding off, Margaret entered the fray wearing her own suit of armor. "What the hell are you wearing?" asked the Roman. The professor puffed out her chest. "What, do you have a problem with women wearing armor?" The Roman reiterated his statement. "I don't have a problem with women wearing armor. Why are you wearing armor?" The professor told everyone that she wished to join the fight. Before they could interject, Avalon stepped in. "Don't worry, I'll keep her safe. When you signal, she'll be with me and Vortiger and the rest of the army. She'll be protected. You have my word." "All right, Avalon, but remember, she's your responsibility, and no harm must come to her until Kairos is weak enough to use the stone. Now, enough talking. Let's ride." The 7, along with Avalon, Vortiger, and Margaret, saddled up and rode out of the village. Was everyone ready for fighting? Surprisingly, as he exited the village, the Wendigo army greeted them. Amanus asked how they got here so quickly. Warren Praetorian explained that Lord Avalon sent them a signal, silent, for only them to hear, when Richard and Amanus returned to the village. The order told them to come to the village with haste. Spartan turned to look at Avalon, who smiled and shrugged. With an army in hand, they journeyed their way to Castle Olympus, and just as he said, one way or another, this would end. And with that, viewers and listeners, we will conclude this episode of the audiobook series. I hope you've enjoyed, and as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below, and be on the lookout for tomorrow's first episode of February's lineup of Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Have a wonderful evening.